with regard to the current war that the Israelis are now fighting in Gaza, the argument is that, and you referred to it earlier, that look, if the Palestinians want to use violence to attack Israel, whether military targets or in this case as well civilian targets, as they did on October 7th, it means we're going to be in war, and when we're in war, it means Israel is going to respond as a country at war, as it's now doing by bombing Gaza, by invading Gaza. With regard to the Israeli war aims, whatever they are, and I want to get to that, but the ostensible war aim is Israel's there to destroy Hamas. Are there any limits at all, moral or legal, that you think are cognizable or valid in terms of how many Palestinians Israel can kill through its bombs, through its invasion, in order to achieve this goal, or is the sky the limit?
I mean, I find that to be the wrong question to ask. It's a sort of like a kind of accountant's approach to war. It's just not how war works. Of course, there are moral limits. Of course, there are and should be legal limits. And it's pretty clear when Israel opens humanitarian corridors, when Israel goes to very significant lengths to try and evacuate so out of areas, that this is not indiscriminate carpet bombing. I mean, we've seen examples of indiscriminate carpet bombing in the very recent past, in Syria, for instance, and they didn't involve extensive efforts. So there were actually deliberate efforts to prevent the evacuation of civilians. So that's what's going on here. The idea that the proper framework to look at this is a sort of, human life being counting, where we look at the number of casualties on both sides, I'm sorry, is a kind of technocratic fallacy applied to an arena that simply doesn't work, in which it actually doesn't accord with the war. That's the law of proportionality. There does not refer to, if you kill one of us, this is how many of you we can kill. What proportionality actually means, it really refers to, it combines ethical considerations about civilian casualties with strategic considerations, operational considerations. What is the value of the target? What is the strategic operational value of the target? And so it makes more sense to look at it that way, rather than to just look at it as a body count on this side and a body count on that side, which is why it's so important to not allow it to get to this point, to not set the conditions. What U.S. policy in the Middle East has been doing for years now. Look, it's not an accident that shortly after the Biden administration took over in Washington, the first little mini, or a recurrence of fighting between Israel and Hamas took place. It's not an accident that the restart of the grand project of U.S. rapprochement with Iran, which is what's really underwriting the current war, it's not an accident that once the Biden administration decided that it was going to abandon the successful Trump approach, which had maintained peace and stability in the region, and return to the failed Obama approach of trying to elevate Iran's status as a regional counterweight and diminish the status of Israel and Saudi Arabia in the region, and bring everybody into a concert of powers, including bringing, integrating, which is the word used by Blinken recently, integrating the Israelis and the Hezbollah-controlled Lebanese armed forces to the north. It's not an accident that once that framework was restarted, there have been a series of wars and an escalating instability leading to catastrophe and tragedy in the region that was actually fairly predictable. Some people, that I was one of the people who was predicting that, which is why I wrote an article in part the end of this kind of U.S. relationship. I could see where things were leading. And now that we're at this point, now that all the meaningful conditions have been put in place that led us to this point, Now you've opened up an abyss. That's what urban warfare is. Urban warfare is hellish. Urban warfare was hell in Mosul when the bombing campaign, which included both aerial bombing and, significant artillery and indirect that leveled the city of Mosul, backed up by Iraqi forces, was sent into Mosul to depose the Islamic State and liberate Mosul from the Islamic State. That was hell. That was absolute hell. And what's going on in Gaza now is also hell. And the thing that is incumbent on responsible political actors is to prevent that hell from opening up. Once that hell does open up, it's not to say that there are no ethical or legal constraints that can be applied, but I think the framework of looking only at body counts and thinking that that's the correct moral or operational framework, it was wrong when it was applied in Vietnam. It was wrong when it was applied in Afghanistan in the other direction. In other words, just holding up body counts and saying we've killed this many people, therefore our military campaign is successful, is a kind of corrupt and bankrupt enterprise. But conversely, just holding up body counts and saying, this is a war crime is also a corrupt enterprise. It doesn't reflect the reality of war. And there's one more thing to add to that. Hamas responsibility to the Palestinian people, as Hamas leaders keep saying in public over and over again, right? There was a piece in the New York Times yesterday where a senior leader of Hamas said, we have no responsibility for water, electricity. Our responsibility is perpetual warfare against Israel until we erase the state. This is what a senior Hamas saying in the New York Times. Now, the sort of defenders of Hamas abroad have been like to translate its own maximalist disregard for Palestinian citizens and belligerence towards Israel. They translate that into like a rationalist, technocratic framework. And, Robert Malley, the former top level negotiator with both the Obama and Biden administrations, who mysteriously was relieved from his post only a few months before this war started, apparently related to what was subsequently uncovered as a very high-level Iranian influence operation at the highest levels of the United States government. Malley famously referred to Hamas as a rational actor, a kind of social movement in the Middle East, and there are people at this very moment who are making the same arguments about Hamas being, essentially just a kind of misunderstood conflict resolution.
Just to be clear, like, I'm not making that argument, but I do want to just.
No.
I know you weren't suggesting it was, but no, I get it. I understand. But I do want to just go back to that question because I actually don't
Can I just finish the one point, Glenn?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Quickly, and I let me clarify now. I absolutely was not saying.
No, I know. I didn't mean to suggest you were. I wasn't. I know. I didn't think you were.
But there is an important thing to understand here, which is that because Hamas is not accountable to Palestinians, as Hamas leaders say publicly, and the Israeli government is accountable to Israeli citizens, Israel has an obligation to pursue victory in warfare. And, this is something I've thought a lot about as an American combat veteran, as an American who participated in catastrophic, futile wars where American leaders refused to pursue victory, where American leaders stranded including myself, in pointless wars in Afghanistan for 2 decades, and not only didn't achieve victory, but explicitly scoffed at the victory, which is something that both the Bush administration and the Obama administrations did. They treated victory like an outmoded. The reason why this is so important is victory is how you secure peace. And this has been true for thousands of years, and it's true now. And can you sometimes avoid war and secure peace through political negotiations? Yes, you can. And every conceivable measure should be taken to prevent war. But once you're in war, The obligation of the sovereign is to achieve a victory that restores peace.
Okay,
Hamas doesn't have that obligation.
That's what I want to zero in on, and that's I don't think it's a technocratic question to say how many Palestinians can end up dead at the end of this war for someone to look at this war and say this was a just war. I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's an incredibly technocratic response to say, well, look, there are these doctrines of proportionality and how you secure victory. We're talking about how many human lives, many, many innocent human lives, children, babies, are going to end up dead. And what I'm asking you is not as a technocratic question, not according to international law or whatever kind of concepts one can invoke when arguing at The Hague, but as a human being, as somebody who can look at this as a moral actor. Is there any number of dead Palestinians that we can reach, 100,000, 500,000, a million, half the population of Gaza, where you would say that simply by virtue of how many Palestinians ended up losing their lives in this war, that this war ended up being unjust? Or, as I said at the start, is it just we don't care about that number? That's not a relevant number, how many died?
No, I think there's the evidence shows that the Israelis do care about that number, and the Americans obviously care about that number also. Yeah, there is I wouldn't say there's a number only. I'm not prepared to put a number on this, because I think that the important question is there deliberate targeting of civilians? Is there an effort to avoid civilian casualties? Who ultimately is placing the civilian fire? All of these things are important. Are there moral trespasses that Israel could commit? Yes, there are unjustifiable moral trespasses that Israel could potentially commit. I have not seen that so far. I've not seen evidence that the Israeli approach to warfare is the singularly brutal approach that is sometimes ascribed by Israel, the kind of approach that we saw in Syria, for instance. I haven't seen that. That's not to suggest that there are no restraints on how Israel can act. There are absolutely restraints, and there are restraints coming both from inside Israel and obviously from Washington as well. I'm not going to, try and parse the numbers with you. I don't know which numbers to trust. Even from critics of Israel, I see wild discrepancies in the numbers. And I know from, past wars between Israel and Hamas that the deliberate policy of Hamas, there's one argument that's made about the inflation of overall casualties. But there's another very clear policy Hamas has to identify everyone killed as a civilian. I mean, this is written Hamas policy. You can look up the instructions they had from 2014 about how casualties should be related to the international media, and it makes clear everybody should be identified as a civilian. Gaza is is an urban environment. Of course, there are some being killed. That is absolutely horrific, and that horror is to some extent inescapable in all war. That's the reality of what war is. The point then is to try and do the war in a way that restores peace without inflicting brutality for the sake of brutality, which is obviously wrong.
Just on the question, though, of the moral guidelines that Israel is using with these humanitarian corridors that you mentioned, in the second week of the war, the Israeli defense minister said, we're going to blockade Gaza and not allow food, water, medication, or fuel to enter Gaza at all. There was just an American nurse, I don't know if you saw the interview, who came back. She works with Doctors Without Borders, who said the reason she was forced to leave Gaza, aside from the fact that her safety could have been endangered, is because there's basically a food supply that even if you use the minimal amount of subsistence that the human body needs just to survive, which is 700 calories per day. There was only enough food in all of that area to last for 2 days. And the UN says the amount of water and food that are being permitted to enter is about 1/10 of what is necessary just for pure subsistence. There's been reports of doctors amputating limbs that get infected because of dirty drinking water, which is then have to be performed without anesthesia. So there's a lot of reports that there's nowhere near enough, even just the basic water and food for the civilian population being permitted in after the Israeli defense minister said, we're going to blockade exactly that from entering into Gaza. Do you think all of that comports with whatever constraints, legal or moral, that you think apply to the conflict?
Well, I know it's going to. There have been statements from a number of Israeli officials that were stupid and blustering, and it doesn't mean that that's been policy in every case. Humanitarian airdrops. I think Jordan was doing humanitarian airdrops with. Through cooperation with Israel, there have been other supplies coming in through the Rafah border. So it's not that no supplies at all have come in. And as I'm sure you saw, there's now an agreement that's been reached to do these for humanitarian. So, I should point out that, 2.5 weeks, we saw, I'm sure your audience saw this as well, all of the reports that the hospitals in Gaza were 24 hours away from running out of fuel. Somehow, 2.5 weeks later, it seems they still haven't run out of fuel. So it seems that there are supplies. That doesn't mean that in every place is getting the adequate level of supplies that they need, though the effort to move people to the south and now to have these regular routine tactical pauses, as the Israelis are calling them, humanitarian pauses, the U.S. is calling them, may facilitate that more. Look, Glenn, if you or somebody else has an operational concept for how Israel can destroy Hamas infrastructure, which includes hundreds of miles of underground works built beneath a densely populated urban area, tunnel networks built largely with international aid money, including U.S. money, tunnel networks that were built over the course of a decade under the supervision of the international community. Actually, a real concept for a way to do that spares civilian life and actually destroys that infrastructure and delivers a meaningful measure of peace to the Israelis, that's something I would certainly consider. For right now, it looks to me like we are seeing a fairly standard, by modern standards, that is urban warfare approach. There's been devastating airstrikes, but less artillery, it looks like, than was used in U.S. wars, accompanied by a ground assault, is placing obviously Israeli soldiers at great risk as they fight in close quarters with Hamas fighters. I don't know how you can go beyond what's been done at this point in terms of bringing supplies in, evacuating people to the south, while also maintaining the need for actual operational victory, which is the only thing that can justify going to war in the first place. In other words, Israel should not go to war in Gaza if it's not capably committed to securing that victory that will bring a measure of peace to its own citizens. You don't go to war to provide humanitarian assistance. It doesn't mean that there's no obligation to civilians once the war has started, but that obligation comes under the overall mission of the war, which is that kind of operational victory.
Right. I mean, but you can't win wars by starving a population or having them die of a lack of water. And I understand the argument that there's a humanitarian
No,
corridor. I don't want to.
You can't win wars that way, and I wouldn't argue that. I wouldn't argue that Israel should, nor is that what's going on now. Look, there are laws of siege warfare that are spelled out. People who are interested in the laws of siege warfare can look them up. Siege warfare, which is considered, you can go look at the appropriate sources in international law, and also from places like the Modern Warfare Institute or other sort of defense think tanks that actually do some of this stuff for a living. And you can look at what siege warfare is. It tends to be the sort of conventional approach. Now, my strategic sense of what Israel should have done is not actually what they're doing right now, but I would not have necessarily launched this kind of operation in Gaza. But if we're going to talk about what's actually happening in the context of international law, and specifically the laws on siege warfare, then there are relevant and applicable statutes here.
Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.